Welcome to the Grow Podcast. I'm Pastor Mike with New Hope Network. We're here to help you take your next step in your relationship with Jesus. I'm so glad you're with us today.
What's up, New Hope family? Welcome to the Grow Podcast, episode 65. My name is David. I'm very excited that you're with us. I'm really excited for these next 30 podcasts. I love the series we're in, and I like kind of how the podcast is kind of touching on even more of the stuff. Last week, but Pastor Mike is with me here as always. Hello, Pastor Mike.
Thank you for stating the obvious.
He's also here. I think because I'm here, I'm going to drag you into more of the, to use the way you're teaching, the lower story stuff, the historical context, because I love that stuff, and that stuff always fascinating to me and interesting to me. Just before we started, we were ranting and raving about different things I would have loved to have talked about on the podcast if they were longer and different,
There's so many things that people argue about and are interesting with history that really don't matter. They could be either way. And now some people would be very offended by me saying that, but really it could be either way.
Yeah. And Pastor Mike's going to list all of them, and then we'll have his home telephone number listed as well, and you can call him and complain. I'm interested to see if you get, last week on the podcast, you said it doesn't really matter if it was a literal 7 days of creation or not.
That may bother some people.
I'm excited to see some.
That may bother some people.
I still remember I think the first time I heard a longer, dialogue about that was my freshman year of college, and my Old Testament history professor, Dean Erickson, shout out Dean Erickson, one of my favorite biblical teachers ever. He was brilliant, and he was an incredible man, and he was really important for me in my college years. But I still remember he got up there and he talked about all these other biblical scholars that he loves and respects. Some of them he knows personally, and he was like, none of them believe it was a literal 7 days. None of them are young earth creationists. And I was just like, I'm at a Bible college. I didn't expect to hear, I expected the opposite. And I didn't really, at the time, I don't know if I had a super strong stance. I just hadn't ever thought about it in any other way. And that caught me off guard. And I'm sure he got some emails.
And I've had several people and some very good friends of mine who I think listen to this, we've talked back and forth. We're like, if it's not a literal 7 days, then we can't trust the rest of the Bible. Part of that is if you take Genesis 1 as a science textbook, then you can say that. If you take it as a theological story, then you can absolutely trust the rest of the Bible.
Why do you think we get hung up on stuff like that?
I think
not that it doesn't matter. Everything has some sort of relevance. So it'll be cool to learn one day.
And I think it's worth studying. Yeah, and Scripture. There are definitively and things that are absolutely scientific and scientific teachings in Scripture. For years we were convinced that, and Christians were convinced that, everything revolved around the earth. And yet you look in the Old Testament, there's some things that very clearly they're going, that's not how this works. And it wasn't necessarily theological teaching. It was saying this is the way the universe works. I think part of it is we tend to miss that there are different, and in the Bible, which we call one book, it's made up of 66 books, and there's different styles of literature in there. And Genesis 1 was written and there's different terms for it, but very oral poetic. So it was made to be an oral tradition written in poetic form. It doesn't mean it's not teaching us, but you have to understand each genre has a different purpose.
Yeah. If I'm just a regular person and I work a regular job and I didn't go to theology school, what's the easiest way for me to just to figure that out? Let's say I'm going to go read one of the prophets, and I want to know okay, Pastor Mike keeps talking about, Genesis was written this way, and this, Revelation was written this way when we talked about Revelation, but I want to know, am I supposed to be taking this, literally? Am I supposed to be taking this?
I think one of the best and easiest way is get yourself a good study Bible. There's a couple ways, but get yourself a good study Bible. I like that. the Application Study Bible, and all it is. So there's different translations. And then there's also different scholars that have come together to put like subnotes and explanations at the beginning of different books that describe, okay, now here's the background, here's the outline of this, here's how this connects to the big story, and here's the genre of this. And I love the Application Study Bible. I tend to, one of my favorite just personal ways is I read personally in the New Living Translation, and I use the Application Study Bible. But there's other ones out there. Another great source is going to YouTube, or you're already on YouTube for some of you, and look up the Bible Project. There's two guys who have put together just some great little snippet videos, but they help you understand some of this. So those are two great resources that are very simple, very accessible. You do not need to be a Greek and Hebrew scholar. Remember, Bible was written by real people for real people, inspired by God, who wants you to understand it.
Right.
And I think the mistake we need other people to understand it and to help us understand it. We don't. Now, I'm going to qualify that.
Okay.
Remember, God is relational.
Sure.
And so he created us for relationships, which means we grow and we can understand when we're in a relationship with him, but he also created us to need other relationships. So when we process it together, like walking through a podcast together, we learn stuff that's the only way we would learn it. Doesn't mean we need to be Greek and Hebrew scholars or history.
That's good, because I am not a Greek or Hebrew scholar.
You might be somewhat of a history scholar.
History nerd is more. I feel like scholar is far too fancy for me.
I'm not sure there's a difference.
I think every history scholar is a history nerd, but not every history nerd is a history scholar. I think it's one of those. That was a far more serious intro than we normally do. Could you do you have a joke for us, Pastor Mike?
We're at 65th episode, so we're retired.
There we go.
There you go. You like
this? This is it. This is
all right. That's it. We're done.
We've loved joining you on the Grow
We've
podcast.
Said everything that needs to be said.
I think we touched on all of it.
65 years.
I think in 65 episodes. Well, there's how many books in the Bible, Pastor Mike?
66.
So we really
that.
had to do was double up one time, and we get the whole thing covered. All the books are the same length.
Yeah.
Jude can go with another book.
What's both amazing and not surprising is that we've had enough to talk about to cover 65 episodes. I'm not sure it's all been worthwhile, but
most of what you said have.
Most people are not surprised that we would have enough to talk about.
That 65
is fair. Episodes. Speaking of which, we should probably get to
Let's
what
talk
we're here
about
for
threads, and it's interesting because if you go back to episode 1 of the Grow podcast, there's a thread that's gone all the way to this one, and
which
is I like to see if I can trip you up during the Grow podcast. So
what's the thread?
We'll see if that happens today, but this last Sunday, if you're watching this Monday when it goes live, yesterday was the second week of Threads, which is the sub-series of our big series, Great
Chapter
Story
2
Ever
in the
Told.
book, if you have the book.
If you're using the book, The Story, Chapter 2 of the book. And so we're in Threads right now. So just give us a kind of a refresher course. Why the threads matter? Why is it important for us to understand all these threads we keep talking about?
Well, there are some things that we read in Scripture that will simply not make sense, or will make more sense when we understand that God didn't waste a moment. He ties everything together. So when we understand God creates, and we can pick on something from the teaching, not the podcast, but the teaching the first week, when we understand everything except humanity, God spoke into existence. He was personally involved. It came out of his character. But in humanity, what's he do? He comes to earth, gets his hands dirty, and breathes life into us. And that's a thread and a repeating pattern that shows how much he's insanely interested in us and involved in us. Every time he's going to do a major work, what's he do? He comes to us. He doesn't. I mean, he's God. He could be 1 billion miles away and go, boom, and it's done.
Right.
He comes to us. And ultimately, that foreshadowing, so he comes to earth, gets his hands dirty, that foreshadows what he ultimately does on the cross. He comes to earth again, gets his hands dirty. This time, earth is driven through his hands in the form of nails. And this time his body is broken and his blood is shed instead of the first time he sheds the blood and breaks the body of an animal to pay the price of sin, and ultimately starts doesn't start the process, but declares the process of dealing with sin finished, and the clock is just counting down the last seconds.
Mm-hmm. We're going to talk.
Eternity.
We're going to talk about Abraham today.
Abraham
was like a perfect person. That's why God picked him, right?
Yeah.
Is that?
Yeah.
Did I listen correctly over the week? On the contrast, he did some stuff.
Name a person in the Bible other than Jesus that you just go, I would trust them. There's not many of them.
That's a small list.
Because we know the story, right? And Abraham, he lies about his wife being his wife, and 2 times actually puts his wife in danger instead of protecting her.
He almost seems
to
compulsive.
protect himself.
He almost seems compulsive about it at times. It's just his automatic response.
And then he does, and we're kind of hard on him for this, but how many of us have done the same thing when we feel like God gives us a promise and we get impatient?
Yeah, I like how you described his response to his wife's idea.
His wife saying,
during the message.
well, it's been 10 years since God promised us a son. Maybe we need to help God. We've got this hot slave named Hagar. She can't say no to you. Why don't you go sleep with her? And Abraham being Abraham, my wife said I can. Okay, not a smart dude.
Yeah. So that guy.
Yeah.
Why is he? What's so special about Abraham?
Well,
Abram/Abraham.
In the New Testament, the book of Hebrews, so almost near the end of the New Testament, there's a chapter that we often call the Hall of Faith because it lists all of these individuals throughout history. None of them perfect. I mean, it lists people like Samson in there. Samson, read his story. We'll get to his story eventually. But it lists Abraham, and it repeats this phrase. And the phrase it uses, like with Abraham in verse, I think it's verse 3, or it lists it. I'm sorry, it's in verse 8 of Hebrews 11, and it says it 3 times. By faith, Abraham. Verse 9, by faith he made his home. Verse 11, and by faith even Sarah. So 3 times. And so it was by faith. And we talked actually several weeks ago before this series, the end of our series on the power of the Holy Spirit early this summer, about what faith means. Faith basically means believing that what God says is true. Mm-hmm. Believing that God says who he is. And that's Abraham at first did not believe. In fact, we find out Abraham was a pagan, a worshiper of the moon. And for some reason he hears, we don't know how, he hears God's voice, says yes, follows God's voice and leadership for 1,400 miles into what we know as Israel, and then there's not enough food, so he goes another 400 miles into Egypt, and then another 400 miles back. And all we know is that happened. We don't exactly know what that looks like. And somewhere in there, we read him saying to God, "Okay, you gave me this promise. How can I know? How can I know?" And for him, there was a moment that God acted, and he went, "All right, I'm going to make a decision on this moving forward." And we talked a little bit about that. We'll talk a little bit about that in the weekend's message. But I think that's true for us. Is for all of us, there comes a point where God will work. He'll never give us 100% certainty. Mm-hmm. Where we have to make a decision. Here's what God said. I'm going to act like God is telling the truth, even when I wonder. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying it's not fake it till you make it. Because David certainly didn't. We'll get, King David later on. Yeah. But we find David repeatedly saying, God, I'm struggling. God, I have questions. But I'm going to choose to believe that you're telling the truth. And so the reason Abraham is considered a remarkable human being is because he grew, and this is key, he grew throughout his lifetime to get to the point where he said, I don't care how it looks. I'm going to choose to believe that God is telling the truth. Was he there in day one? No. But he allowed God to grow him there. And I think you and I, we can become that kind of remarkable human being. This is an ordinary guy. This isn't a, fantastic, huge man of the faith. He's an ordinary guy. We can get there where we just say, okay, God, it doesn't always make sense. I don't always understand, but I'm going to choose to say and believe that you're telling the truth.
Yeah. There's always quite a price in the Bible to being one of the like great examples of the faith, because we always hear about like the worst things that they did in their life,
Yeah.
which helps us relate to them, like shows. But I don't know if I'd love like all of the worst things I ever did being written down for eternity for everybody to read, just so that they can then be like, oh, but look how God helped him through that.
Yeah. And we all kind of like, we'd love a book written about us. No, you really wouldn't.
Yeah, right.
You really wouldn't.
Let's talk about covenants for a little while, because they're not we're not familiar. And so when we read or hear about this covenant that God has with Abraham, we're like, what are we doing? Why are we chopping
and that was
stuff
a big
up?
part of the teaching on Sunday.
It's gross.
Yeah.
But why is it so weird?
Yeah. So archaeologists in the ancient world have uncovered multiple places where covenants were a normal part of the ancient world. And most of them, especially in the cradle of civilization, so kind of what we call the Middle East, most of them are what I don't know who labeled it first, but and I'm probably going to slaughter the name, but this is how I pronounce it: suzerain vassal covenants. Basically, it's between a powerful person and a non-powerful person, and the powerful person essentially saying, "I'm going to force you to submit to my will," and to reinforce that in the ancient world, the person who had no power, the person who was conquered, would walk a path of blood. And that was, we got to remember, historical context, ancient world. It was a bloody, tribal place. And it started with Adam and Eve. It actually started with God. Adam and Eve made the choice, and we talked about this last week. Adam and Eve made the choice to go outside of limits, and they introduced death. And the first death was actually at the hands of God, because part of it, I believe personally, Scripture doesn't teach this way, but I believe personally, it so broke the heart of God. He's going, this is a consequence of this, and especially the first animal to die that he had just created. I believe God, in compassion and mercy and even brokenheartedness, in a sense, said the first one to die is going to die at my hands, because it's only going to get more cruel from here. But and again, the enemy always takes something that was meant to redeem and twists it into something. And so in the ancient world, it just became increasingly bloody, increasingly bloody. And this happened all over the case. So let's fast forward to the days of Nebuchadnezzar, later in the Old Testament, near the end of ancient Israel. And think Daniel, Meshach, Abednego,
Shadrach.
I knew I was missing one. Shadrach and Benny. I should remember that from
Shack and Benny.
Shack and Benny.
It's get the VeggieTales in the right order.
My kids are out of order.
Phenomenal episode.
Yeah.
If you would like me to sing all of the songs from that episode,
Please
I could do that right now.
Please don't. But we look at that. So when Nebuchadnezzar conquered Israel, he took a portion of the population and took them away. And what was the purpose for that? A lot of times, a lot of the times, it was to say, if those of you who remain disobey, this group of people, your kids will pay the price. And in some cases, and we see this even later in the medieval times, what would happen with a conquering king, or a main king with his chieftains all over, dukes and lords. He would take their kids and they would come live with him. It's not any. That's the kind of covenant in the ancient world. And so when God makes his covenant with Abraham, Abram assumes that this is God, the king, saying, obey or you die. And this is the craziness of God's love. God doesn't let him. Instead, God says, if you don't obey, I will die to make it right. And of course, ultimately he does. And this is the first of 5 covenants. There's other covenants, but 5 major covenants that lead us all the way up to Jesus that we can trace through the Old Testament. There's actually one that predates this. Now, you've looked at the notes. You remember what it is?
Well, I did learn of these 5 in college, but it was his covenant with Noah.
With Noah.
Yeah.
And God promises that he will never flood the world again because of sin.
Yep.
And what was interesting is there was no expectations on Noah or us.
Yeah.
It was God saying, I'm not going to do this again. This is a covenant. And he puts the sign of the rainbow in the skies. It's upon, basically, God was saying, I'm declaring that it's my job, not your job, to find a way to free you from sin. And that's the beginning. Again, this is a thread, so it goes all the way back to right after Adam and Eve sinned. He gives the promise, someday, Satan, there will be someone who comes who will crush your head and you will strike his heel. And this thread of promise. So God's first major covenant is, it's upon me.
Is it the only one of the covenants that has like no expectation?
Basically,
for us?
the expectations change and evolve with time. So like with Abraham, it's saying, Abraham, you follow me. Now, if you disobey, I'll pay the price.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's second one. Then we get to the Mosaic covenant, the 10 commandments. And this is contained in, instead of the 6 verses of Genesis 12, this is contained in Exodus 9 through 24 and re-explained in Deuteronomy and Leviticus again, and Numbers again. And it's a list of requirements, and this is a conditional one. And the reason was God was teaching them what he'd started. So the thread we talked about last week, the limits, was teaching them that life is lived best when you live it inside the limits that I created. And he was teaching them the limits. And some of it were limits that weren't necessarily part of the original plan, but limits now to live in a sin-infected world. To be free from disease. Those kinds of things. And so it was a covenant of saying, here are the limits that you follow, and I will bless you. Here's how you live this. If you don't, then there will be a price to pay. And part of that covenant too was along the way, you will have to be redeemed and continually paid for, because you aren't going to be able to live according to all these things. So that's the third one. Fourth one is more specific. So here's the interesting thing. If you watch the rotation of these, so the first one, we call it the Noah covenant, but it wasn't just with Noah, it was with humanity.
Okay.
Second one was Abraham. It was with an individual that ultimately affects and applies to all of us. The third one was with a nation. The fourth one is back to a person. See, there's a pattern here, and it's the what we call the Davidic covenant. This was the covenant with David, King David, when he became king. You can read about it in 2 Samuel 7. And it's called in the ancient world a royal grant covenant. Basically, it's when a king recognizes that a covenant has been breached and grants a pardon and says, I'm going to pay the consequence for your breach. So it's already recognizing that the Mosaic and the Abrahamic covenant have been breached. And he's saying, but David, I'm still. So it's some of this is a repeating thread that's coming. There's one condition saying that to make this happen, that basically saying someone in your line is going to pay the price for the breach of covenant. And now someone from your line will always be on the throne. Always be on the throne. The condition is the person on the throne can decide whether they're on the throne with God's blessing or God's curse. So they'll always be on the throne, but they get to decide. So it's adding to the Mosaic covenant. And then, of course, the last one is the new covenant.
So I want to pause, and I have 2 questions. One is relevant, one is not relevant.
Okay.
We're going to go not relevant first. It's the Abrahamic, the Mosaic, and the Davidic covenant. Why isn't it the Noahic covenant? Why is it just the Noah covenant? He doesn't get the IC on the end of it? That seems unfair.
Maybe it's harder to say, and maybe
it
scholars
is a lot harder to say.
Maybe I deleted that because...
My relevant question is, I think even if I haven't spent a lot of time studying, I'm familiar with the phrases, the new covenant and the old covenant. But you didn't mention the old covenant. Which of these covenants then is the old covenant? You know, the fifth one was the new covenant. What's the old covenant?
The old covenant really is a combination of the first four, but primarily what happened at Mount Sinai. And most people, when they refer to the old covenant, they're referring to what happened at Mount Sinai, the Mosaic covenant. So that's where they built the tabernacle. God, again, remember, God always pursues imperfect people.
Yeah.
So what's he do? He says, I want to come live among you. Now, in order for me to live among you, I'm a holy God, you're an unholy people. Here's how this happens.
So then tell us
So the
quick
new
about
covenant,
the new covenant.
you can read about, it's actually foreshadowed in Jeremiah 7 in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, we find it in multiple places. The Apostle Paul in his writings referred to it in multiple places. And the Bible makes it clear in the New Testament that the new covenant, the reason it's called the new covenant, is it replaces the others because they were all broken. So they were declared defunct, not without power, not without importance, but they were all broken. So the new covenant is saying the first four were broken, therefore we need to replace them with one because you do not have the power to live up to the covenant. So I'm going to make it possible for you to live up to the covenant. And the amazing craziness of this is the thread in all four of the first one recognized the fact that we would not be able to live up to them. And pointed to the fact that these will be replaced. But there's a humanity learning curve. You know, remember, this goes another thread all the way back to the beginning. At the end of every day, God said, every day, but the sixth day, God said it was good. Everything that God does is good. Because we kind of look at it and go, why didn't he just jump to the new covenant? Because upper story, God has a plan to pursue us. And he knew that humanity would need the process and the time and the story, all of us, along the way. So the new covenant replaces the one we're broken, and it takes ultimately the consequences of all of the broken covenants upon God himself, which was promised all the way back in the garden, and that he would pay the consequences for all of them. So in one sense, it replaces them. In another sense, it says we're all living under the old ones because we've all broken them. And we all deserve to die. That's the path of blood. But Jesus now has taken that upon himself. And this one went further than all of the others. This one makes it possible for us to have a new heart and to remove the problem that tripped us up before. You know, when God flooded the world, it didn't do away with sin. Why? Because Noah was still there, and Noah was infected. And so sin continued. And this one, it made it possible for us to have a new heart and for us to be free from sin. And you get 4 promises in the new covenant. He will be our God, and we will be his people. Okay? And this is real important. So follow me on this one. 4 promises you read about this in the new covenant. He will be their God, and they will be his people. He would give them the ability and the desire to follow him. In other words, he'll change their hearts and give them a zeal for obedience. This is out of Jeremiah. He will forgive the sins of people. And then we find out we get to be part of his ongoing mission. Isn't that what Jesus said in his last words to us? Go and make disciples. Okay. The reason those are important, if you summarize those, he says, I'm going to give you a new heart. I'm going to give you a new family. I'm going to give you a new closeness. We're going to deal with the separation of sin. And I'm going to give you a purpose, a new purpose. Do those 4 things sound like anything else that we've read in any other covenant? Those are the 4 promises that God gave Abraham in the covenant with Abraham. God said, I'm going to take you to a place. I'm going to turn you into a people. I'm going to give you a people, a family. I'm going to change who you are, your personhood. I'm going to give you a new closeness with me, and your life has a purpose. You will be a blessing. This is the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant that can still happen with us. And in the book of Galatians, it actually says, you don't have to be biologically related to Abraham. If you follow Jesus, you are the recipient of the same promise that God made Abraham. And you can have and experience those 4 things. And the reason this matters is because all the way back to the garden, we lost our place. We lost our personhood. We lost our
Yeah.
character. We lost our presence with God, and we lost our purpose. What was our purpose? To rule and to have authority.
Yeah.
And now we can have all 4 of those back. See the thread? The
Yeah.
thread just follows all the way through.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's I looking at all the 5 covenants that way, but then doing it with the threads and seeing how that
Yeah.
the Abrahamic covenant and how that ties into the new covenant so clearly intentionally. It's just amazing.
I mean, not that we would say they're disconnected stories, because we know they're
Well,
part
sure,
of that story.
yeah.
But when you start looking at what
Yeah.
God was actually doing, you have to understand upper story, get the historical context. Then it makes sense for us. You go,
Yeah.
oh, God is the master storyteller.
Mm-hmm.
It's like that storyteller, and you can name your author, whoever it might be, that you read, and then you go, wait, I need to go read that book again, because I didn't know, like a master mystery writer that gave you all of the clues,
Like a Chris Nolan movie,
yeah,
Inception.
or Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. It was a little bit more obvious with some of his stuff, but
Yeah.
it goes back and points it out. And you go, oh yeah, that was in there. How did I
Yeah.
miss that? One of Kylie's and my favorite is a guy from early 20th century, Rex Stout. And he gave you all the clues to answer the mystery, but you don't see them until the end. You go, how did I miss that? And that's what God is
Yeah.
putting in there. He didn't hide it. It's
Sure.
right there in plain sight, but you've got to back off and see everything. And when you see it, you just go, wow. And then you can understand Abraham.
Mm-hmm.
When Abraham, who understood the suzerain vassal covenant, saw God walk the path of blood.
Mm-hmm.
You want me to sacrifice my son, years later? I saw God guarantee with his body and his blood that his promise would be fulfilled. And we find out in Hebrews 11, the reason he didn't object, because he knew that God would raise Isaac from the dead, because he had watched God walk the path of blood. And when you and I choose to take God at his word, and that's part of why he's given us these threads, we can see everything he's done. We go, okay, I think we can take him at his word.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Pastor Mike. Do you have any more like a next step, homework, anything like that?
I'm going to continue with this unless there's some specific things.
Read the story.
Read the story.
Yeah.
So this would be chapter 2 in the story, or you can start with chapter 11 in Genesis and read all the way up to where it begins to talk about Joseph.
Mm-hmm.
So you can read those, but at least the story of Abraham in Genesis 12 through about Genesis 15, 16.
Yeah. We'll do it again this week. We probably won't do it every single week, but we'll do it again this week. We'll put a link where you can buy, if you haven't bought the story yet. It doesn't mean you have to buy it from that link. You can buy it all sorts of places, and I think you even said you have a digital version of it, so you can buy a digital version of it too. But we'll put a link there so you can get the book, The Story, and be reading along. I hope that you guys are loving this new series as much as I am. It's been great. I really like doing these podcasts with you too, Pastor Mike. I'm excited to keep going on. Remember to subscribe if you haven't done that yet. Like the video, or if you're listening on a podcast app or whatever, leave us a comment or a review. It helps people find us easier, and we really appreciate the feedback. We like knowing what we can do better. If you need more, tales of Pastor Mike as a young lad, let us know that in the chat. In fact, if everybody on YouTube can comment, we need more stories of Pastor Mike as a wee young lad with that specific language.
No, we don't.
I'll make sure to get a few more in the future. But we love all of you. We hope that we'll see you on the weekend, and then we will see you on the next podcast.